Hi there, my name is Hannah Edwards, and today I wanted to talk to you about one of the greatest leaders of all time, Winston Churchill. So, in order to analyze any great leader, it's important to firstly look at how they grew up and what successes in their childhood led to their successes in later life. Then it's important to analyze their competencies as a leader and how those play a role in leading to their successes. And then it's also important to look at specific successes within their path to great leadership and their path to greatness. And it is also important to check their failures and see how those failures led them to accomplishing some of the greatest feats that they've accomplished in their lifetime. So as a child, Churchill was a very tenacious child. He was born in 1874 on November 30th to an aristocratic family. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, and his mother, Jeanette Jerome Churchill, were very instrumental in his childhood in making sure that he afforded the best primary schools and formal schools. Growing up in Dublin, Ireland, he was very fortunate to, go into London and to study at different important schools. But at these schools, he was a little bit of a troublemaker at times. A lot of teachers said that they couldn't, keep him in line. They couldn't keep him in his chair throughout the day, and he would grow very bored and a little bit restless during school. In 1888, though, he did go on to study at the Harrow School, where he joined the Harrow Rifle Corps. And here he was able to really establish himself as a prominent military strategic thinker. And he was able to, get a little bit of hands-on time in military tactics. And this definitely led into some of his greater achievements in life. So as far as the competencies that any leader should have, Churchill was very fortunate to have at least two of these. And he did have a really great background of, working hard to fill in certain gaps within his own leadership style. And firstly, Churchill was very innovative. He was the first to establish a minimum wage act in 1908 in Great Britain. And as far as today's terms go, this is only about a 30-cent per hour minimum wage, which is a little bit wild to us, living in this day and age where we have, $7.25 is usually the average minimum wage nationally. And with this, Churchill definitely established himself as a prominent mind in championing for the poor. He was very influential in making sure that people could afford, the greatest things that they, needed in life. With his Minimum Wage Act, he ensured that the average working week was 40 hours, and that each day was a maximum 8 hours of work. And this was very important in industries such as, mining and other industrial work, in factories. This was very important in ensuring job satisfaction as well as job safety. In the Industrial Revolution within Britain, it was incredibly common for people to be worked tirelessly into exhaustion, and their work would become almost dangerous at times. And Churchill was also a very great communicator. As a leader, he was, just absolutely known for his acumen at communicating thought and communicating thought into action. He gave a very famous speech called Our Finest Hour, as it has been heralded in the years since, in 1940 to the House of Commons. And what this Finest Hour speech did was it kind of woke the House of Commons up. It said, hey, we need to go out there and do some stuff, or else, our lives are going to be made more sinister than we could ever know. And he even mentioned the United States in his speech, which is a little bit of a harrowing thought to even wonder, if Germany had succeeded, what would our lives be like today? The entire world would be different. And so this speech he gave to the House of Commons implored them to act, and so they did act in what was called the Battle of Britain, which was known as the first German defeat during World War II. And Churchill, too, he established his leadership style, both legitimate and earned, as well as sometimes a little bit more of an abrasive type of style within his, types of power. And so Churchill, he was the Home Secretary for a year in Britain. He's also the First Lord of the Admiralty and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was the British Secretary for the State of War, and he also served 2 terms as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. His terms as Prime Minister leading up to World War and during World War II. His other type of power, the first being legitimate power he had earned, his second type of power he often utilized was coercive power. He used this specifically in the Kenyan and Malaya foreign policy crises, and he was often seen as too abrasive with his actions. So in Kenya and Malaya during this time, a lot of rebellious activities were happening. A lot of people were kind of acting out against royal rule from the Crown of Britain. And so he was able to send in, the military. He was able to send in fighting men to fight against these rebels and to kind of quiet any rebellions that were happening. And a lot of people weren't very responsive to this in the spirit of democracy, which Churchill believed firmly against. He said that democracy was not a very great way to lead or a great way to establish a country. He said, that this needed to be done and that these rebellions needed to be put out, or he would take even further action against them. And while a lot of people were thankful for this because they were also thankful to the crown, a lot of people were not very responsive to this, and they eventually acted out against him even further and against the UK as a whole, causing Britain to lose its foothold in African colonialism. So Churchill had several successes, most notably his successes in allying the United States and the Soviet Union. So with this, Churchill was able to usher in a time of prosperity for not only the Soviet Union, but for Great Britain and America as well. And so with this, he was able to establish the Allies to act against the Germans. And later, after the war, he was able to establish the United Nations while working with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the acting president of the United States at the time. And again, like I had said before, the Battle of Britain was a huge success for Britain as well as for Churchill personally. As with any great leader, though, he did have some failures that coincided with his successes. In 1915, a little bit earlier in his career, he did have one of the greatest failures that Britain claims to be the greatest failure. It was one of the greatest follies and mistakes of military mind for decades. He sent troops into Turkey at Gallipoli as an invasion, and it did not go well at all. There were mass casualties on both sides. There was an estimated combined 1 million soldiers from, both sides, and over 500,000 of these died. And looking back, Churchill definitely says that his hubris was responsible for this huge defeat and this crushing loss. And his wife often recollected in later years that she had, worried that maybe his grief over sending all these men into this pointless battle would kill him, because she just worried that he would take it so personally that he just couldn't come back from it. But fortunately, he did come back from it, and he was able to usher in one of the greatest times of, military prosperity during World War II by allying the Soviet Union and the United States. This was just one of the greatest successes in military strategy for a long, long time. And his ability to kind of, discover what the best route to get people in and out of certain situations and certain battles definitely helped the whole world kind of, get World War II straightened out and to defeat Hitler. His ability to create the United Nations alongside FDR was a huge accomplishment that he was quite proud of himself, and that the world over, gives him the responsibility for this. And they say, thank you for creating an organization that can, bridge a gap between countries and kind of help everyone communicate a bit better. And he was a 2-time prime minister, which is a huge feat in itself. It's like being a 2-term president. It's just a lot of responsibility and a lot of movement within that. Winston Churchill is absolutely one of the greatest leaders that the world over has ever known. And he did say quite often in his later years that he wondered if most of his successes could have been made possible without having so many failures as he did. And he just was such an influential leader, and we can still feel his movement within society even today. So thank you so much for being an audience to this presentation on Winston Churchill, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.